History is a battlefield, and truth is the first casualty. Welcome to the History Frontline, May 11th, 1939, the Mongolian steppe, a place so remote, so desolate, that most maps didn't even bother marking it properly. Just endless grass, burning sun, and a border that nobody could agree on. 4 months before Hitler would unleash hell on Poland. 4 months before the world would recognize the start of World War II. But out here, in this forgotten corner of Asia, the real war had already begun. It started with horses. A Mongolian cavalry patrol crossed a river. The Japanese said it was their side. The Mongolians said otherwise. Shots were fired. Men died. And just like that, two empires found themselves staring each other down across a dusty riverbank that most people had never heard of. The place was called Khalkhin Gol. The Japanese called it No-Mon-Han. Neither name means anything to you, does it? That's because this battle was buried, erased, written out of history by the very people who fought it. But here's what they don't want you to know. This forgotten clash in the middle of nowhere decided whether Japan would attack America or Russia. It determined whether Moscow would fall to the Nazis. It changed everything. The river itself was barely worth the name. Shallow, winding, cutting through grassland that stretched to the horizon in every direction. No cities, no resources, nothing that looked worth fighting over. But borders aren't about logic, they're about pride. And in 1939, pride was the most dangerous commodity on earth. The Japanese Empire was hungry. They'd already swallowed Manchuria, turned it into a puppet state they called Manchukuo. They'd invaded China, bogged down in a war that was bleeding them dry. But the army generals in Tokyo had bigger dreams. They looked north, toward Siberia, toward the vast Soviet Union, and they saw weakness. They saw land. They saw destiny. The Soviets saw something different. They saw a threat. Japan's Kwantung Army, stationed in Manchuria, was over 1 million men strong, battle-hardened, fanatic, led by officers who believed they were warriors of a divine emperor, destined to rule Asia. Stalin couldn't ignore them. The border between Soviet-backed Mongolia and Japanese-controlled Manchuria was a powder keg. Everyone knew it. The question was, who would light the match? That Mongolian cavalry patrol was the spark, but it wasn't an accident. Both sides had been probing, testing, pushing the line for months. The Japanese commanders wanted to teach the Soviets a lesson, show them that the Kwantung Army was not to be trifled with. The Soviets wanted to draw a line in the sand, make it clear that they wouldn't be pushed around in their own backyard. Within days, the skirmish escalated. Japanese infantry poured across the river, supported by light tanks and artillery. They expected the Soviets to fold, to retreat, to negotiate. Instead, they ran headfirst into something they weren't prepared for. Soviet artillery opened up. Not the scattered, disorganized fire they'd expected, but a coordinated barrage that turned the riverbank into an inferno. Japanese soldiers dug in, waiting for the bombardment to stop, waiting for their chance to charge with bayonets fixed and prove their superiority in hand-to-hand combat. That's what they'd been trained for. That's what Bushido demanded. The bombardment didn't stop. And then the tanks came. Not the light, tinny machines the Japanese were fielding, but real armor. Soviet BT tanks, fast and heavily armed, rolling across the steppe in formation. Behind them came waves of Mongolian cavalry, not the romantic image of horsemen with sabers, but mounted riflemen who could shoot from the saddle and vanish into the grassland before you could blink. The Japanese held their ground. They had to. Retreat was unthinkable. Their commanders had told them they were invincible, that Japanese spirit could overcome any material disadvantage. So they fought. And they died. In the heat, in the dust, far from home, far from anyone who would remember their names. By the end of May, both sides had committed thousands of troops to a battle that neither government officially acknowledged. In Tokyo, the newspapers didn't mention it. In Moscow, it was a footnote. But on the ground, men were killing each other with a savagery that would have made the trenches of World War I look tame. The Japanese command made a decision. They would escalate. They would send in their best units, their most experienced commanders, and they would crush the Soviets once and for all. They would prove that the Imperial Army was a force to be reckoned with. They had no idea what was waiting for them, because in Moscow, Stalin had made a decision too. He was sending someone special to take command, a man who would turn this obscure border clash into a laboratory for modern warfare, a man who would write the playbook for how to destroy an enemy army so completely that they would never forget it. His name was Georgy Zhukov, and he was about to teach the world a lesson in mechanized warfare that would echo all the way to Berlin. But first, he had to get there. The Trans-Siberian Railway carried him east, across thousands of miles of forest and steppe, toward a battlefield that didn't officially exist. He traveled in secret, with orders signed by Stalin himself. Take command, stop the Japanese, do whatever it takes. Zhukov arrived in early June, and what he found appalled him. Soviet forces were scattered, poorly coordinated, led by officers who didn't understand the terrain or the enemy. The Japanese had air superiority, their fighters strafing Soviet positions at will. Casualties were mounting, morale was cracking. Zhukov didn't waste time with speeches or reassurances. He started planning. He studied maps. He interviewed survivors. He calculated distances, fuel consumption, artillery ranges. And slowly a picture formed in his mind, not of defense, not of attrition, but of annihilation. The Japanese thought they were fighting a border skirmish. Zhukov was going to turn it into a graveyard. The Kwantung Army was not like other military forces. It was a cult, a machine built on fanaticism, hierarchy, and an unshakable belief in Japanese racial superiority. Its officers didn't just serve the emperor, they worshipped him. They saw themselves as samurai reborn, warriors of a divine nation destined to rule the inferior races of Asia. Their Bible was the imperial rescript to soldiers and sailors, a document every soldier had to memorize. It told them that duty was heavier than mountains, that death was lighter than a feather. It told them that surrender was the ultimate dishonor, that a true Japanese soldier fought until his last breath, and if capture seemed inevitable, he took his own life. This wasn't just propaganda, they believed it, completely. Officers who failed in battle were expected to commit seppuku, ritual suicide, to cleanse their shame. Soldiers who surrendered brought disgrace, not just on themselves but on their families, their villages, their ancestors. The stigma was so profound that families would hold funerals for soldiers taken prisoner, treating them as if they were already dead. In the field, this philosophy created an army that was terrifying in close combat. Japanese infantry trained relentlessly with the bayonet. They practiced night attacks, screaming charges designed to break enemy morale through sheer audacity. They were taught that Japanese spirit, Yamato Damashi, was superior to any weapon, that courage could overcome tanks and artillery, and for years it had worked. In China, against demoralized and poorly equipped opponents, the Kwantung Army had rolled through cities and countryside alike. Banzai charges had broken Chinese lines. The threat of a bayonet attack had sent enemy units fleeing. The myth of Japanese invincibility had grown with every victory. But myths shatter when they meet reality, and the reality rolling across the Mongolian steppe was 60 tons of Soviet steel. Georgy Zhukov believed in numbers, cold, hard, mathematical certainty. He didn't care about spirit or morale or warrior traditions. He cared about firepower, logistics, and combined arms coordination. He'd studied the latest theories of mechanized warfare, read the German manuals on blitzkrieg tactics, absorbed everything the Red Army had learned from its disastrous experiments in the Spanish Civil War. He knew that modern war was not about bravery, it was about concentration of force. It was about using armor, artillery, and air power together in a coordinated symphony of destruction that no amount of individual courage could withstand. When Zhukov looked at the battlefield, he didn't see brave Japanese soldiers charging with bayonets. He saw targets, he saw kill zones. He saw a problem that could be solved with enough shells and enough tanks in the right place at the right time. His first order was simple: bring up everything. He demanded tanks, hundreds of them. He called for artillery, regiment after regiment of heavy guns. He requisitioned aircraft, bombers and fighters to wrest control of the sky from the Japanese. And he demanded fuel, ammunition, food, water, everything an army needed to operate hundreds of miles from the nearest railroad. The logistics were staggering. Mongolia had no infrastructure, no roads, no depots, no supply dumps. Everything had to come from Siberia, trucked across empty grassland on routes that barely existed. But Zhukov was relentless. He told his logistics officers that failure was not an option. Stalin was watching. The world was watching, even if they didn't know it yet. By July, the build-up was in full swing. Convoys of trucks rumbled across the steppe, kicking up dust clouds visible for miles. Tank units arrived by rail and then drove overland, their engines roaring through the night. Artillery batteries dug in, camouflaging their positions with grass and netting. The Japanese saw some of this. Their reconnaissance flights reported increased Soviet activity, but they misread what they were seeing. They thought the Soviets were preparing to defend, to dig in and wait for the Japanese to attack. They had no idea that Zhukov was preparing an offensive that would dwarf anything seen in this theater. Because the Japanese high command had made a fatal assumption. They believed their own propaganda. They thought that Japanese soldiers were simply better than Soviet soldiers. Man for man, unit for unit, they were convinced of their superiority. They had beaten the Russians before, back in 1905, in the Russo-Japanese War. That victory was burned into the Japanese military psyche. It proved that Asians could defeat Europeans, that Japan was destined for greatness. But that was a different war, a different Russia, a different world. The Soviets of 1939 were not the Tsarist forces of 1905. They were hardened by civil war, by purges, by Stalin's brutal industrialization drive. They were equipped with modern weapons, mass-produced in factories that could outproduce anything Japan had. And they were led by officers who, despite Stalin's paranoid purges, understood mechanized warfare in a way the Japanese simply did not. Zhukov embodied this new Soviet approach. He was cold, calculating, willing to spend lives if it meant achieving his objective. He didn't believe in glorious charges or heroic last stands. He believed in overwhelming firepower applied at the decisive point. He believed in maneuver, in using his tanks to get behind the enemy, to cut them off, to destroy them not through courage, but through superior positioning and logistics. The contrast couldn't have been starker. On one side, an army that valued spirit over science, that trained its men to die bravely rather than retreat smartly. On the other, an army that treated war as an engineering problem, solvable with enough steel and enough coordination. The Japanese were about to learn which philosophy worked better on a modern battlefield. In late July, the Kwantung Army launched what they thought would be a decisive offensive. 6,000 men, supported by tanks and artillery, attacked across the Khalkhin Gol River. Their objective was to destroy the Soviet bridgehead on the east bank, push the enemy back, and establish Japanese dominance once and for all. They advanced with confidence. Japanese flags flew from tank turrets. Officers led from the front, swords drawn, ready to inspire their men through personal example. The infantry followed, rifles and bayonets ready, screaming battle cries that had broken Chinese armies. The Soviets let them come. Zhukov had prepared his defenses carefully. Anti-tank guns were hidden in the tall grass, camouflaged and waiting. Artillery spotters called in coordinates. Tank units were positioned in reverse slope positions, invisible to the advancing Japanese. When the trap was sprung, it was devastating. Anti-tank guns opened fire at point-blank range, shredding Japanese armor. Soviet tanks crested the ridges and poured fire into the flanks of the Japanese formations. Artillery crashed down, not random harassment, but carefully plotted barrages that walked up and down the Japanese lines. The Japanese attacked again, and again, and again. Each time they were thrown back with heavy losses, but they kept coming. Because that's what their training demanded. Retreat was dishonor. Failure was unthinkable. By the end of July, the Japanese offensive had ground to a halt. They'd lost hundreds of men and dozens of tanks for minimal gains. but they hadn't lost faith. Their commanders regrouped, called for reinforcements, and prepared for another push. They didn't realize they were being set up. Every attack they launched gave Zhukov more information, more data on their tactics, their capabilities, their weaknesses. He was studying them, like a scientist studying insects, and when he had learned enough, he would show them what real modern warfare looked like. August 1939. The steppe was on fire, not metaphorically, literally. Grass fires sparked by artillery shells and burning tanks turned vast swathes of the battlefield into a blackened wasteland. The smoke hung in the air, thick and choking, mixing with dust to create a haze that turned noon into twilight. The temperature soared above 40 degrees Celsius, 104 Fahrenheit. Men cooked inside their tanks, sweating through their uniforms, desperate for water that was always in short supply. The wounded died not from their injuries, but from dehydration, lying in the sun while medics struggled to reach them across terrain swept by machine gun fire. This was hell, and the Japanese were walking into it willingly. Orchestrated vivid warfare narrative emphasizing brutality and technological disadvantage. ต้องเขียนต่อ Part 3 ให้ครบประมาณ 1,300 คำ โดยเน้นไปที่ความรุนแรงของการต่อสู้ การบรรยายสภาพสนามรบที่โหดร้าย การรบทางอากาศ ความทุกข์ทรมานของทหารญี่ปุ่น และการที่พวกเขาเริ่มตระหนักว่ากำลังเสียเปรียบด้านเทคโนโลยี แต่ก็ยังดื้อรั้นไม่ยอมถอย จำเป็นต้องหลีกเลี่ยง ตัวเลขอาราบิกต้องเขียนเป็นคำ สัญลักษณ์ทุกชนิดคำสั่งเสียงในวงเล็บ การใช้ไวยากรณ์ซับซ้อนเกินไป ต้องสร้างภาพที่ชัดเจนเป็นจังหวะและดึงดูดอารมณ์ The Kwantung Army's commanders had committed to a strategy of attrition. They couldn't match Soviet firepower, so they would match Soviet will. They would attack again and again, bleeding the enemy until their morale broke. It was the only playbook they knew: attack, never retreat, victory or death. The Soviets were happy to oblige. Zhukov had turned the Khalkhin Gol sector into a killing field. Every approach was covered by interlocking fields of fire. Artillery batteries were positioned to deliver pre-plotted barrages on any concentration of Japanese troops. Tank units were held in reserve, ready to counterattack any breakthrough. The entire defensive system was designed to funnel the Japanese into kill zones and then annihilate them. And it worked. God help them, it worked. Japanese infantry attacks followed a predictable pattern. First came the artillery preparation, Japanese guns firing everything they had to soften up Soviet positions. Then came the tanks, light Type 95s and Type 97s, rumbling forward with infantry following close behind. Finally came the assault wave, soldiers with bayonets fixed, screaming war cries, rushing the last 100 meters under fire. Sometimes they reached the Soviet trenches. Sometimes they even broke through, driving the defenders back in vicious hand-to-hand fighting. Japanese soldiers were experts with the bayonet, trained to kill with precision and speed. In close quarters, they were deadly. But then the Soviet tanks would arrive. BT-5 and BT-7, fast tanks, racing across the steppe at speeds the Japanese couldn't match. They'd hit the flanks of any breakthrough, machine guns chattering, crushing infantry under their treads, turning victory into massacre in minutes. The Japanese had nothing that could stop them. Their anti-tank rifles were nearly useless against Soviet armor. Their light tanks were outgunned and out-armored. They tried desperate measures. Soldiers running at tanks with satchel charges, officers emptying pistols at vision slits, even attempts to climb onto the tanks and pry open hatches. Most died before they got close. Those who succeeded often found themselves trapped, beaten to death by tank crews or shot by supporting infantry. It was bravery wasted, courage spent on a task that tactics and technology had made impossible. The air war was equally one-sided. Initially, the Japanese had dominated the skies. Their Type 97 fighters were superior to the Soviet I-15 biplanes that first opposed them. Japanese pilots were skilled and aggressive, racking up kill after kill in the early engagements. but Zhukov called in reinforcements. Newer I-16 monoplane fighters arrived, faster and more heavily armed. More importantly, he brought in dedicated ground attack aircraft, SB bombers, and R-5 reconnaissance planes converted to carry bombs. They came in waves, targeting Japanese artillery positions, supply dumps, and troop concentrations. The Japanese had no effective anti-aircraft defense. Their mobile units lacked dedicated AA guns. Soldiers fired rifles uselessly at aircraft passing overhead. All they could do was scatter and take cover when the bombers came. By mid-August, Soviet aircraft were flying hundreds of sorties a day. They had air superiority, and they used it mercilessly. Japanese units moving in daylight were spotted and bombed. Supply convoys were strafed. Even at night, there was no rest, as Soviet aircraft dropped flares and bombs on suspected Japanese positions. The psychological toll was immense. Japanese soldiers, trained to face enemy infantry with courage, found themselves helpless against an enemy they couldn't reach. Artillery shells rained down from miles away. Aircraft bombed them from heights they couldn't touch. Tanks crushed their positions before infantry could even engage. This wasn't the war they'd trained for. This wasn't the war they'd been promised. This was industrial-scale slaughter, and all their courage, all their spirit, couldn't stop it. Water became the most precious commodity on the battlefield. The steppe heat was brutal, and the Japanese supply system was breaking down under Soviet air attacks. Soldiers went days with minimal water, their canteens empty, their tongues swollen. Some drank from muddy shell holes, contracting dysentery that killed as surely as Soviet bullets. Medical care was primitive. The Japanese had few field hospitals, and those they had were overwhelmed. Wounded men lay in the open, flies swarming their injuries, waiting for treatment that often never came. Morphine ran out, bandages ran out. Doctors performed amputations without anesthesia, holding men down while they screamed. The lucky ones died quickly. The unlucky ones lingered for days in agony before succumbing to infection, dehydration, or blood loss. And still, the attacks continued. Japanese commanders threw regiment after regiment into the fight, convinced that one more push would break the Soviets. They believed in attrition, in wearing down the enemy through sheer persistence. They didn't realize that the Soviets were being reinforced faster than they could inflict casualties. Zhukov's supply lines, as tenuous as they were functioning. Trucks arrived daily with ammunition, fuel, food, and water. Wounded were evacuated back to field hospitals in Mongolia. Replacement troops arrived to fill the ranks. The Soviet war machine was grinding, but it was grinding forward. The Japanese war machine was grinding itself to pieces. By the third week of August, the Kwantung army had lost thousands of men and most of its armor in the Nomonhan sector. Units were under strength, demoralized, exhausted. Officers began to quietly question whether victory was possible. But they didn't dare voice those doubts aloud. Defeatism was treasonous. Questioning orders was insubordination. They had to attack. They had to keep fighting, even as Zhukov prepared to destroy them utterly. Because while the Japanese had been battering themselves against Soviet defenses, Zhukov had been assembling something unprecedented in this theater. A strike force. Not for defense, not for counterattack, but for annihilation. Hundreds of tanks, thousands of infantry, artillery regiments by the dozen, all being positioned in secret, hidden from Japanese reconnaissance, waiting for the order to attack. The Japanese suspected nothing. Their intelligence reports showed a defensive enemy, battered but holding, probably preparing to retreat if pushed hard enough. They saw what they wanted to see, an enemy on the ropes, ready to break. They were blind, and Zhukov was about to make them pay for that blindness with their lives. Warfare is theater. The best generals understand this. Victory doesn't always go to the strongest or the bravest. It goes to the side that controls what the enemy believes. Georgy Zhukov was a master of deception. Throughout late July and early August, while Japanese units were grinding themselves down in frontal attacks, Zhukov was orchestrating an illusion. He wanted the Japanese to believe that the Soviets were on the defensive, that they were hurt, that they were preparing to fall back if pushed hard enough. So he gave them evidence to support that belief. Soviet radio traffic increased dramatically. Encrypted messages flew back and forth, discussing defensive positions, discussing the construction of bunkers and fallback lines. Zhukov made sure some of these transmissions were sent in codes the Soviets knew the Japanese had broken. He wanted them to read his fake plans. Meanwhile, actual construction began on defensive fortifications, well behind the front lines. Trenches were dug, bunkers were built, barbed wire was strung. Japanese reconnaissance flights photographed all of it and reported back. The Soviets are digging in. They're preparing to defend. They're worried about another Japanese push. Perfect. While the Japanese watched the defensive preparations, the real work was happening out of sight. Tank brigades were moving into position under cover of darkness, their engines muffled, their movement carefully timed to avoid aerial observation. Artillery regiments deployed in carefully camouflaged positions. Infantry units marched at night and hid during the day. The challenge was immense. You can't hide hundreds of tanks. Their engines are loud, they kick up dust, they leave tracks. Even at night, the sound of an armored column carries for miles across open steppe. Zhukov's solution was elegant and brutal. He used sound trucks. These were ordinary vehicles fitted with loudspeakers that played recorded sounds. Hammering, construction work, the general noise of an army building fortifications. They were positioned near the fake defensive works, creating an audio smokescreen that masked the real sounds of tank movement happening miles away. At the same time, Soviet aircraft increased their patrols, flying more aggressively, forcing Japanese reconnaissance planes to stay high or risk being shot down. The higher the Japanese flew, the less detail they could see on the ground. And for the movements they couldn't completely hide, Zhukov used timing. Tank columns moved during the hours when Japanese air patrols were lightest. Infantry marched when morning fog or dust storms reduced visibility. Supplies came up at night on routes far from the front lines. The Japanese saw pieces of the puzzle but couldn't put them together. They saw more Soviet aircraft but assumed it was defensive posturing. They heard construction noise and saw defensive works being built. Their intercepted radio intelligence confirmed what they wanted to believe. The Soviets were hurt and preparing to defend against the next Japanese offensive. What they didn't see was the noose tightening around their neck. By August 19th, Zhukov had assembled an overwhelming force. Over 500 tanks, over 500 aircraft, thousands of artillery pieces, tens of thousands of infantry, all positioned in a vast arc north and south of the Japanese salient, ready to strike from both flanks simultaneously. The Japanese 6th Army, the main force at Nomonhan, had maybe 25,000 men in the salient. They were exhausted, undersupplied, and about to be hit by a force 3 times their size from directions they weren't watching. Zhukov held one final briefing with his commanders on the evening of August 19th. The plan was simple in concept, devastating in execution. At dawn, artillery would open fire across the entire front, not a preparatory bombardment, but a sustained barrage designed to pin the Japanese in place and shred their defenses. Then the pincers would close. Tank brigades would strike from the north and south simultaneously, driving deep behind Japanese lines to cut off their escape routes. Infantry would follow, mopping up isolated units. Aircraft would provide close air support, bombing and strafing anything that moved. The goal was not to defeat the Japanese, it was to destroy them, to surround them, cut them off from supply and reinforcement, and then systematically annihilate every unit in the pocket. It was, in essence, a textbook double envelopment. Hannibal had done it at Cannae, the Germans would perfect it in France. But Zhukov was going to demonstrate it in Mongolia first, using mechanized forces in a way that would become the template for modern armored warfare. The Japanese had no idea it was coming. Their commanders were planning their next offensive, scheduled for late August. They were focused on building up supplies, rotating tired units out of the line, preparing for another push that would finally break Soviet resistance. They went to sleep on the night of August 19th, thinking they controlled the battlefield. thinking they would choose when and where the next battle would be fought. They were wrong. At 5:45 a.m. on August 20th, 1939, the Soviet artillery opened fire. Not the scattered harassment they'd been enduring, but a wall of fire that turned the entire Japanese salient into a hellscape of explosions and flying steel. The ground shook, the sky lit up with muzzle flashes. Thousands of shells screamed overhead and crashed down on Japanese positions. Command posts were obliterated, communication trenches collapsed, supply dumps exploded in massive fireballs, and through the smoke and dust and chaos, the tanks came. The thunder of artillery was so loud that men couldn't hear their own screams. The barrage had been going for 30 minutes, and the Japanese positions looked like the surface of the moon, cratered, smoking, utterly devastated. Then it stopped. Sudden, eerie silence, broken only by the ringing in everyone's ears and the moans of the wounded. That's when they heard the engines. From the north and south simultaneously, Soviet armor appeared. Not probing attacks, not cautious advances. This was a wall of steel. Hundreds of tanks rolling forward in formation, their guns firing, their treads crushing everything in their path. The Japanese had nothing that could stop them. Anti-tank positions that might have slowed the advance had been destroyed in the bombardment. Infantry units were scattered, disoriented, their command structure shattered. Officers tried to rally their men, but the chaos was total. How do you organize a defense when you can't communicate, when your positions are obliterated, when tanks are already behind your lines? The northern pincer struck first. 3 tank brigades, over 200 tanks, smashed through the thin Japanese screening forces and raced east. Their objective wasn't to fight the Japanese frontline units, it was to get behind them, to cut the bridges across the Khalkhin Gol River, to trap the entire Japanese 6th Army on the east bank with no way to retreat. The southern pincer moved simultaneously. More tanks, more infantry, driving north to meet their counterparts and complete the encirclement. Soviet commanders had clear orders. Speed was everything. Don't stop to fight. Don't get bogged down. Drive for the objectives. Close the pocket. Japanese units tried to respond. Tank platoons counterattacked, only to be overwhelmed by superior numbers and firepower. Infantry positions held their ground bravely, firing at the passing Soviet armor until they were bypassed and left isolated. Officers drew their swords and led desperate banzai charges that accomplished nothing except adding to the body count. This wasn't warfare, this was execution. By noon, the pincers had met. The entire Japanese 6th Army, over 20,000 men, was trapped in a pocket roughly 10 miles across. Every road out was blocked. Every bridge was in Soviet hands. They were surrounded, cut off, and being systematically destroyed. Soviet artillery, repositioned during the morning, began a sustained bombardment of the pocket. Not random fire, but carefully coordinated strikes based on aerial reconnaissance. Japanese units trying to organize were spotted and shelled. Supply dumps were targeted and destroyed. Command posts were identified and obliterated. The Japanese tried to break out. Multiple times throughout that afternoon and evening, units formed up and attacked the encirclement, trying to punch through to safety. Some attacks were made by organized regiments. Others were desperate mobs of stragglers, running at Soviet positions with whatever weapons they had left. None succeeded. Soviet defenders had prepared their positions well. Machine guns were sighted to cover every approach. Anti-tank guns waited for any Japanese armor that attempted to break through. Artillery was on call to hammer any concentration of troops. The few Japanese units that reached Soviet lines were annihilated in close-quarter fighting. Soviet infantry, many of them veterans of the Spanish Civil War, were no longer the poorly trained conscripts the Japanese had faced in earlier clashes. They knew their business. They held their ground. As night fell on August 20th, the pocket was a scene of absolute carnage. Thousands of Japanese soldiers were dead or wounded. The survivors were low on ammunition, out of food and water, and surrounded by an enemy that showed no signs of letting them escape. Japanese commanders radioed for help. They begged for reinforcements, for air support, for permission to retreat. The responses they got were cold and bureaucratic. The Kwantung Army headquarters, safely back in Manchuria, issued orders to hold position, to fight on. to die with honor if necessary. No relief was coming. The nearest Japanese units were over 100 miles away, and the Soviets controlled all the territory in between. Air support was impossible. Soviet fighters dominated the sky, shooting down any Japanese aircraft that tried to reach the pocket. The men in the encirclement were on their own. The second day was worse than the first. Soviet forces tightened the ring, pushing inward from all sides. The pocket shrank from 10 miles across to 5, then to 3. Japanese units were compressed into an ever smaller area, making them easier targets for artillery. Water ran out. In the August heat, dehydration became as deadly as Soviet bullets. Wounded men died, not from their injuries, but from thirst, crying for water that no one could provide. Some soldiers drank their own urine. Others dug frantically in the ground, hoping to find moisture. The psychological pressure was unbearable. Japanese soldiers had been taught that they were invincible, that their spirit would carry them to victory. Now they were trapped, helpless, being killed by an enemy they couldn't even see. Artillery killed from miles away. Aircraft bombed from heights they couldn't reach. Tanks crushed their positions before they could respond. Officers tried to maintain discipline, but it was futile. Men broke. Some went catatonic, staring at nothing, unresponsive to orders. Others went berserk, charging out of positions in suicidal attacks that ended in seconds. A few tried to surrender, only to be shot by their own officers for cowardice. Because surrender was unthinkable. The field service code was clear: death before dishonor. A Japanese soldier did not surrender, ever. If capture seemed imminent, he killed himself. That was the rule. That was the expectation. So they fought on, not because they thought they could win, not because reinforcements were coming, but because dying in battle was preferable to the shame of living as a prisoner. On August 23rd, the Kwantung Army headquarters finally authorized a retreat. Units still outside the pocket were ordered to pull back to defensive positions in Manchuria. The men inside the pocket received different orders: break out or die trying. They tried. In the pre-dawn darkness of August 24th, the survivors formed up for a final, desperate assault. Maybe 3,000 men, all that was left of an army that had numbered over 20,000 just 4 days earlier. They attacked west, trying to force their way across the Khalkhin Gol River and escape into Manchuria. Officers led from the front, swords drawn, faces set in expressions of grim determination. Soldiers followed, bayonets fixed, ready to die. Soviet positions erupted in fire. Machine guns, rifles, artillery, everything opened up at once. The attack dissolved in a storm of bullets and explosions. Men fell by the dozens, the hundreds, cut down before they could close with the enemy. A few hundred actually reached Soviet trenches. The fighting was savage, hand to hand, no quarter given or asked. Japanese soldiers used bayonets and swords and fists, fighting with a desperation born of absolute hopelessness. Soviet defenders fought back with equal ferocity, knowing that this was the end, that they just had to hold on a little longer. By dawn, it was over. The last organized Japanese resistance had been crushed. A few hundred men, maybe, managed to slip through Soviet lines in the chaos and escape into the desert. The rest were dead, wounded, or about to be. The Battle of Khalkhin Gol was over. The Soviets had won a complete, total, devastating victory. They had surrounded and destroyed an entire Japanese army using tactics and technology that the world had never seen before, and the consequences would ripple across the globe. The survivors straggled back to Manchuria in ones and twos, burned, broken, bleeding. They had left behind their weapons, their pride, and over 18,000 of their comrades. The Kwantung Army tried to hide it. Reports were falsified. Casualty figures were minimized. The battle, which had involved nearly 70,000 troops and lasted 4 months, was dismissed in official communiques as a minor border incident. The Japanese government told its people nothing. But you can't hide a catastrophe of that magnitude. The soldiers knew, the officers knew, and the knowledge spread like poison through the ranks. Japanese military culture had no framework for processing defeat. Victory was expected, sacrifice was honored, but losing, being outfought, outmaneuvered, and humiliated by an enemy you'd been taught to despise, There was no precedent, no guidance, only shame. The officers who had commanded at Nomonhan were destroyed, whether they survived the battle or not. Some were officially reprimanded, their careers ended, their names struck from the honor rolls. Others were allowed a more dignified exit, retirement on grounds of illness, quiet reassignment to meaningless posts. And some chose the traditional way out. In the weeks following the battle, there was a quiet epidemic of suicides among Kwantung Army officers. Not the public, ritualistic seppuku of samurai legend. These were private affairs, conducted behind closed doors, covered up by families and colleagues who understood that shame had to be erased, even if only in death. A regimental commander shot himself in his quarters. A staff officer hanged himself. A tank battalion leader drove his car into a ravine. The official causes of death were always something else. Illness, accident, natural causes. But everyone knew. Failure had to be paid for in blood. The enlisted men who survived faced different torments. They were rotated out of frontline units, scattered across different postings, kept away from journalists and civilians who might ask uncomfortable questions. They were told, explicitly, never to speak of what happened at Nomonhan. Not to their families, not to their comrades, not to anyone. Some obeyed. They buried the memories deep and tried to move on. Others couldn't. They drank. They had nightmares. They woke up screaming, seeing Soviet tanks rolling over their foxholes, hearing the whistle of incoming artillery, feeling the thirst that had nearly killed them. Post-traumatic stress wasn't recognized in 1939 Japan. There was no treatment, no counseling, no support. Soldiers who broke down were weak, defective, shameful. Some were quietly discharged, sent home to families who didn't understand why their sons or husbands couldn't sleep, couldn't work, couldn't function. But the worst damage wasn't to individuals, it was to the institution. The Kwantung Army had thought itself invincible. It was the elite of the Japanese military, the spearhead of empire, the force that would conquer Asia. Nomonhan shattered that illusion. The army had been beaten, not by Chinese guerrillas or colonial militias, but by a modern, mechanized European force that had demonstrated complete tactical and technological superiority. The realization was devastating. Japanese tanks were obsolete. Japanese artillery was outranged. Japanese infantry tactics, all those glorious banzai charges and bayonet attacks, were suicidal against an enemy with modern weapons and competent leadership. And there was one more thing. The Soviets had demonstrated something terrifying. They could move enormous forces over vast distances, supply them adequately, and coordinate complex combined arms operations in terrain that should have made such operations impossible. They had logistics, they had organization, they had competence. The implications were clear and horrifying. If Japan went to war with the Soviet Union, if they invaded Siberia, as so many army officers dreamed of doing, they would be destroyed. A quiet panic spread through the upper ranks of the Kwantung Army. They had been agitating for years for a northern strategy, for an invasion of the Soviet Far East to seize resources and expand the empire. Nomonhan made that plan untenable. The cost would be too high, the risk of total defeat too great. But they couldn't admit that publicly. To do so would be to acknowledge weakness, to give ammunition to their rivals in the Navy, to undermine the very foundation of the military government's authority. So they lied. They covered up. They pretended Nomonhan was insignificant, even as they fundamentally reassessed Japan's strategic position. Soviet intelligence watched this process with interest. Richard Sorg, the Soviet spy embedded in the German embassy in Tokyo, filed detailed reports about the mood in Japanese military circles. He documented the debates, the recriminations, the quiet desperation of officers who realized they'd been living in a fantasy. The Japanese army was traumatized. It had developed what military psychologists would later call a defeat complex regarding the Soviet Union. Officers who had been hawkish about invading Siberia suddenly found reasons to advise caution. Units that had trained for northern operations were quietly reoriented toward other theaters. The phobia of the north had taken root. Japanese soldiers who had never been to Nomonhan heard stories. They heard about Soviet tanks that couldn't be stopped, about artillery that fell like rain, about air attacks that came wave after wave without respite. The stories grew in the telling, becoming almost mythical. And there was some truth to them. The Soviets had demonstrated a new kind of warfare at Khalkhin Gol, a preview of what they would perfect against the Germans 2 years later. Zhukov had written the playbook for deep battle operations, for using mechanized forces to envelop and destroy enemy armies. The Japanese had been the test case, the proof of concept. They had learned the lesson the hard way. The question now was what they would do with that knowledge. Would they accept their limitations and scale back their ambitions? Or would they redirect their aggression toward enemies they thought they could actually beat? The answer would determine the course of the Pacific War, and the world was about to find out which path Japan would choose. Tokyo, September 1939. Behind closed doors in the Imperial Palace and the halls of the Army Ministry, a debate raged that would decide the fate of millions. The Japanese military was split. Two factions, two visions of empire, two completely incompatible strategies for achieving Japanese dominance in Asia. The Strike North faction, led by army officers, had long advocated for war with the Soviet Union. Their vision was straightforward: invade Siberia, seize its resources, create a land empire stretching from Manchuria to the Urals. They saw the Soviets as weak, divided by Stalin's purges, vulnerable to a determined Japanese assault. Nomonhan had destroyed that argument. You couldn't claim the Soviets were weak when they just annihilated an entire Japanese army in 4 days. You couldn't argue for invading Siberia when your own generals were quietly admitting that Japanese tanks, artillery and tactics were hopelessly outclassed. The Strike North faction didn't disappear overnight, but their influence was broken. Officers who had been pushing for northern expansion suddenly found their proposals shelved, their briefings cancelled, their recommendations ignored. Into this vacuum stepped the Strike South faction, led primarily by the Imperial Japanese Navy. Their vision was different: expand into Southeast Asia, seize the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies, the rubber plantations of French Indochina, the tin mines of Malaya. Build a naval empire, not a land one. The Navy had always been skeptical of the Army's Siberian obsessions. They pointed out correctly that Siberia had minimal resources worth taking. The real prize was to the south: oil, rubber, tin, rice, all the raw materials Japan desperately needed to fuel its war machine and feed its people. There was just one problem. The colonial powers, Britain, France, Holland, and behind them, the United States. Taking Southeast Asia meant war with the Western powers. It meant challenging the world's largest economy and most powerful navy. But the Navy argued that this was winnable. Britain and France were distracted by the war in Europe. The Americans were isolationist, weak-willed, unwilling to fight. A swift, decisive campaign could secure the resources Japan needed before the Western powers could respond. The army, still reeling from Nomonhan, found these arguments persuasive, not because they believed the Navy's optimistic assessments, but because the alternative was admitting that Japan's military expansion had hit a wall, that they had no viable strategy for achieving their imperial ambitions. So the consensus shifted, quietly, reluctantly, without ever officially acknowledging that Nomonhan had changed everything. Throughout late 1939 and 1940, Japanese strategy reoriented southward. Training exercises focused on amphibious operations and jungle warfare. Intelligence gathering intensified on British and Dutch colonial defenses. Diplomatic probes tested how far Japan could push before the Western powers would respond. The answer seemed to be pretty far. When Japan pressured French Indochina for basing rights, the Vichy government capitulated. When Japan threatened the Dutch East Indies, the Dutch negotiated rather than fight. When Japan signed the tripartite pact with Germany and Italy, forming the Axis alliance, the Americans protested but did nothing. Each successful provocation emboldened the Strike South advocates. Each Western concession convinced them that America was a paper tiger, too weak and divided to stop Japan's southward advance. But there was a line: oil. America supplied 80% of Japan's oil imports. If that supply was cut off, the entire Japanese war machine would grind to a halt within months. The Navy knew this, the Army knew this, everyone knew this. In July 1941, after Japan occupied southern Indochina, the Americans finally acted. President Roosevelt froze Japanese assets and imposed a total oil embargo. Britain and the Dutch followed suit. Overnight, Japan's oil imports dropped to almost zero. The clock was ticking. Japan had maybe 18 months of oil reserves. After that, the fleet couldn't sail, the Air Force couldn't fly, the Army couldn't move. The choice was stark: back down and abandon all territorial gains, or go to war while they still had the resources to fight. The Navy had been planning for this scenario. For years, they'd been developing a strategy to defeat the United States in a quick, decisive campaign. The cornerstone of that strategy was a surprise attack on the US Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. Destroy America's battleships in a single blow, secure 6 months to a year to consolidate control over Southeast Asia, then negotiate a favorable peace before America's industrial might could be brought to bear. It was insane. It was desperate. It ignored every lesson of history about America's industrial capacity and willingness to fight when provoked. But it was the only option that didn't involve admitting defeat. Here's the twist that history books often miss. The decision to attack Pearl Harbor was directly influenced by what happened at Nomonhan. If Japan had won at Khalkhin Gol, if they'd proven that their army could defeat the Soviets, the Strike North faction would have prevailed. Japan would have joined Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941. They would have attacked Siberia while the bulk of the Red Army was fighting in Europe. America would never have entered the war. Pearl Harbor would never have happened. The Pacific War, as we know it, would never have occurred. But Japan had lost at Nomonhan, decisively, humiliatingly. They had learned that fighting the Soviets meant getting crushed by superior technology and tactics. So, when Hitler invaded Russia in June 1941 and begged his Japanese allies to open a second front, the answer was no. The Japanese had seen what Soviet mechanized warfare looked like. They wanted no part of it. Instead, they turned south, toward oil, toward rubber, toward the colonial empires that seemed weak and vulnerable, toward a confrontation with America that they convinced themselves they could win. On December 7, 1941, Japanese carrier aircraft struck Pearl Harbor. In one morning, they crippled the US Pacific Fleet, killed over 2,000 American servicemen, and brought the United States into World War II. The Pacific War had begun. 4 years of brutal fighting across thousands of islands and millions of square miles of ocean. Millions dead, cities obliterated, and at the end, atomic fire over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. All of it traceable, in part, to a battle in the Mongolian desert that most people have never heard of. Khalkhin Gol didn't just defeat the Japanese Sixth Army, it redirected the entire thrust of Japanese expansion from north to south, from the Soviet Union to the United States. The consequences were global, because while Japan was attacking Pearl Harbor instead of Siberia, the Soviets were free to do something that would change the course of the war in Europe. They could move their armies west. September 1941. Moscow was dying. German armies had smashed through Soviet defenses and were closing on the capital. Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union, had achieved stunning success. Millions of Soviet soldiers were dead or captured. Entire armies had been encircled and destroyed. The Red Army seemed on the verge of total collapse. Stalin was desperate. He was rushing reserves to the front, pulling units from wherever he could find them. But there was one place he didn't dare weaken: the Soviet Far East. 50 divisions, battle-hardened troops equipped with tanks and artillery, sat idle on the Manchurian border, watching for a Japanese attack that never came. Stalin couldn't move them, not while Japan remained a threat. If he stripped the eastern defenses and Japan invaded Siberia, the Soviet Union would face a two-front war it couldn't possibly survive. But what if Japan wasn't going to attack? What if the trauma of Nomonhan had convinced them to stay out of the war? How could Stalin know for sure? The answer came from Tokyo, from a spy named Richard Sorg. Sorg was the perfect intelligence agent, German by birth, communist by conviction, charming by nature. He'd infiltrated the German embassy in Tokyo, befriended diplomats and military attachés, and gained access to highly classified information. The Soviets considered him one of their most valuable assets. In October 1941, Sorg sent a message that would change the war. Japanese cabinet meetings, intercepted through his sources, had definitively decided against attacking the Soviet Union. Instead, Japan was preparing for war in the Pacific, targeting British and American holdings. The Strike North faction had lost. There would be no Japanese invasion of Siberia. The message reached Moscow on October 4th. Stalin, paranoid and suspicious by nature, didn't trust it at first. It seemed too good to be true. But as corroborating intelligence came in from other sources, he began to believe. Japan was attacking south, not north. The Far Eastern Front was secure. Stalin made the decision. Starting in early October, trains began rolling west from Siberia. One division, then another, then 10, then 20. The elite Siberian divisions, the units that had fought and bled at Khalkhin Gol, were being transferred to the defense of Moscow. These weren't green conscripts or hastily trained militia. These were professional soldiers. Many had combat experience against the Japanese. They knew how to fight mechanized warfare. They had quality equipment, T-34 tanks, Katyusha rocket launchers, modern artillery. More importantly, they weren't demoralized. Unlike the Western armies that had been shattered by German blitzkrieg, these units hadn't experienced defeat. They'd won at Khalkhin Gol. They believed they could beat a technologically superior enemy. The Germans had no idea they were coming. In late October and early November, as German forces pushed toward Moscow in what they thought would be the final offensive, they started encountering fresh Soviet units. Units that fought with skill and determination. Units equipped with tanks the Germans had never seen before, like the T-34, which outclassed anything the Wehrmacht had. The German advance slowed, then stalled. Then, on December 5th, 1941, the Soviets counterattacked. The Siberian divisions led the assault. They'd been training for winter warfare their entire careers. The cold didn't slow them down, it made them stronger, while it froze the Germans whose equipment and tactics were designed for summer campaigning. The Soviet offensive pushed the Germans back from Moscow. Not far, just 20 to 60 miles, but it was enough. Moscow was saved. The German army, which had seemed invincible, had been stopped and thrown back. The myth of Nazi military supremacy was broken. That counteroffensive changed the psychological balance of the war. It proved that the Germans could be beaten. It gave hope to resistance movements across occupied Europe. It convinced the British and Americans that the Soviet Union would survive, that Germany would face a long, grinding war on multiple fronts. And it was made possible, in large part, by a battle in Mongolia 2 years earlier. If Japan had won at Khalkhin Gol, they would have attacked Siberia in 1941. Stalin would have faced exactly the two-front war he feared. He couldn't have moved the Siberian divisions west. Moscow would have fallen. The Soviet government would have evacuated or collapsed. Hitler might have won. Instead, Georgy Zhukov's victory in the Mongolian desert gave Stalin the breathing room to survive. The same man who had demonstrated mechanized warfare at Khalkhin Gol was now applying those lessons to save Moscow. Zhukov commanded the defense and the counteroffensive, using the tactics he'd perfected against the Japanese to bloody the Germans. The chain of causation is almost too perfect to believe. A forgotten border clash led to Japanese trauma, which led to the decision to attack Pearl Harbor, which meant no attack on Siberia, which freed up the divisions that saved Moscow, which kept the Soviet Union in the war, which eventually led to Nazi defeat. History turns on hinge moments. Khalkhin Gol was one of them. A battle that almost nobody remembers, fought in a place almost nobody has heard of, between armies representing empires that no longer exist. But its echoes shape the world we live in today. The officers and men who fought there are long dead now. The battlefield itself is quiet, just empty grassland and monuments that few people visit. The rivers still flow, the grass still grows, and the sky is vast and indifferent. But for a few months in 1939, that forgotten corner of Mongolia was the most important place on Earth. The decisions made there, the blood spilled there, the lessons learned there, rippled outward and touched every continent. The Japanese learned that they couldn't beat the Soviets and turned toward Pearl Harbor. The Soviets learned that mechanized warfare could destroy armies and used those lessons to beat the Nazis. The world learned, though it didn't realize it at the time, that small battles in remote places can change everything. History is written by the victors, they say. But sometimes history is written by the forgotten, by the soldiers who died in a place nobody cared about, fighting a battle nobody remembers, for stakes they couldn't possibly have understood. The steppe is quiet now. The smoke has cleared. But the scars remain, carved into the earth and into the flow of human events. Khalkhin Gol, Nomonhan, the battle that decided the fate of World War II, the hidden battlefield that changed everything. The smoke may clear, but the scars remain. Thank you for joining us on the front lines. Subscribe to keep the investigation alive. This is the History Frontline. Dismissed.